Welcome to the show Brain Rot, What Our Screens Are Doing to Our Minds, a special series from the New Books Network. Here are your hosts, Dr. Karyne Messina and Dr. Harry Gill.
Hello. Welcome to our new podcast and YouTube video, Brain Rot, What Our Screens Are Doing to Our Brains. As a point of interest, brain rot was the 2024 Oxford Word of the Year. It refers to deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, particularly as a result of overconsumption of trivial or unchallenging material, especially online content. And it also captures the essence of our podcast, which is a special series on the New Books Network. I'm Dr. Karyne Messina, a psychologist, psychoanalyst, author, and a New Books Network podcast host. I'm discussing these topics with Dr. Harry Gill, a well-known psychiatrist who also has a PhD in neuroscience. So today we're going to pick up from where we stopped last time on Erik Erikson's fifth stage of development, which occurs from approximately ages 6 through 12, and it's called industry versus inferiority. But I'll talk about that later. We're going to start with talking about neuroscience, the neuropsychological aspects of what's going on with children and young adolescents, preteens who are exposed to too much screen time with their digital devices. So, Dr. Gill, how does screen time affect the development of young people in this, or children and young people in this age group? And specifically, maybe white matter, how that's affected. And you might want to describe what white matter is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Karyne. So yeah, that's a good place to start, which is a distinction between gray matter and white matter in the brain. Gray matter is mostly in the outside of the brain, and it represents the cells, cell bodies. White matter are all of the connections between those cell bodies that transmit information from one part of the brain to the other. So to give a very simple example, the visual input when we're looking at something goes through white matter into the occipital cortex, where the visual information is processed. Then the images that we see are then through the white matter, through the wiring of the white matter, forwarded to the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex references those visual images against our memories and identifies what it is that we're actually looking at. Now, as you can see, it's a very complicated process that involves a lot of wiring at incredible speeds. So all of this happens, everything I just described happens under 10 milliseconds. So it's generally accepted that our conscious experience of visual input, I'm going to stay with visual input, is it requires about 10 milliseconds and above for us to actually be aware of what we're looking at. So all of this shuttling through the white matter of images, it actually takes place very, very quickly. Following identification of what we're looking at, frontal lobe can make a decision, what do we want to do about it? So if a child is playing with a MAGNA-TILE, first they will identify all the MAGNA-TILEs, and some decisions will be made about how to put them together. And frontal lobe will also initiate the motor movement that signals to the muscles of our body to move in such a way to pick up MAGNA-TILEs in coordinated fashion and put them together. I'll get back more to the topic why that is so important. So during the process of early development, we're born with, think of it as too much wiring. There are lots of cells, and they're interwired in very complicated ways, and there's a lot of wiring that needs to be pruned.
A garden, maybe.
Exactly. Like a garden with lots of weeds and lots of ivy, and it's all intertwined. So you can't even walk through it, basically. So thank you, Karyne, for that analogy. We'll talk in one of the podcasts about autism, where the wiring and the pruning are actually very important and probably underpin the symptoms that we see in autistic children. But sticking with the normal development through the childhood, but particularly in this period of life, 6 to 12, there's an awful lot of pruning that takes place. What does that mean? It means that the pathways that the child is using and engaging in are reinforced and wired more. The pathways that are not used are pruned, and therefore some skills are lost or they diminish and need to be built at a later time.
If one doesn't sort of use it or lose it?
Use it or weaken it at this point in time.
Okay.
Eventually, there is a complete loss of capacity. So you can very easily, based on these just very quick outline of the brain development, you can begin to see that the kids really have to do things, not just see things. They have to engage. And the process that involves just the visual part, that is an internal recognition of the images, registration of what the image is informing us about, and then with the screen, maybe engaging two thumbs, is only part of the process that in reality in the course of normal development involves actual physical activity and optimally interactions with your peers. This is also the critical period of life where kids are really beginning to engage and learn how to be little social beings. So the politics of the playground, politics of interactive play, politics of sharing, beginnings of affection and the feeling, emotional regulation, all of that happens in what is a really critical part of development. And also, at least in my experience, period of development where screens are stealing vast portions of time away from the development. One of the aspects that I know Karyne is going to talk about more that is particularly worrisome is a critical function of developing what's called frustration tolerance is essential in this period of time. Screens tend not to frustrate. Screens want kids to be engaged, and therefore they're not frustrating. Kids receive pleasurable feedback and occasional failure in game, but there's always that stay with us that is built in by the algorithm. When a 7-year-old is building a pyramid of cards, and when they fall apart, he gets very angry and frustrated. And that feeling of accomplishment, ability to tolerate frustration, is what this term industry versus inferiority is all about.
Right. I've been thinking about MAGNA-TILEs and also Legos. So I saw a child watch MAGNA-TILEs being built. And, this other child on a screen was building a structure and they'd fall down. And maybe the child would look frustrated, but it didn't really register. It didn't seem to with the child I was watching. And so the child would just watch and sort of in awe of what the TV child could do. What was very clear to me is that the child who I was observing in person was not dealing with the frustration of the tower falling, was not developing any capacity to be patient, and was not thinking about structures and how he might do it differently. He was just watching this other child. So he really wasn't benefiting from this tower being built. Whereas if he had the MAGNA-TILEs himself, I think it would have been a whole different situation. So I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And to expand on your point, one of the interesting developments in sort of commercialization of toys, and so even the physical toys, to me has been the transformation of Lego that I remember as a child myself, where Lego primarily is essentially a three-dimensional puzzle that requires really no imaginative skill. It requires the skill to read a very detailed manual The Lego set comes in 10 little bags. Each bag is assembled following a detailed manual. So it's very easy to do. As we mentioned, I have a young child, so I marvel at how quickly he can go through a Lego set that is $150 and he assembles it in 2-3 hours and we're good to go. But there is no imaginative work that is required. So increasingly, I have been encouraging use of just plain Lego pieces to figure out how to make a house, how to make an airplane from the pieces that exist. And it is much more frustrating, but in some ways, very fascinating. And the imagination at play is always more creative and interesting than something that comes as a puzzle piece with instruction manual.
It's interesting you say that because I have a patient who has 2 grandsons, and she used to work with them and building things, particularly the older one with Legos all the time. But she would just buy a bag of Legos, and I didn't even know initially that a person could do that. But turns out you could just buy a bag of random Legos. It's interesting to watch children just construct something without the 10 little bags of the little pieces. I'm usually the sorter, but it's a much different experience watching them put it together.
It is how they acquire a sense of industry where they actually made something. The other aspect of which speaks to white matter development is the fact that screens don't give brain data points about the physicality of the world that we live in, that something is heavy, that something moves at a particular rate. All of those are things that children need to internalize. It all looks very light, it moves very quickly, it is weightless, and very easy. Karyne and I were chatting earlier about teaching an 8-year-old how to start a fire and what that process is like, and the physicality of holding the flame and maintaining it without whipping the starter around and putting the flame out. The child learned it very quickly, but it was also very clear that conceptually there was no reference. The fires are started on the screen in a very easy fashion that is engaging and fun and entertaining, not frustrating.
Absolutely.
So from the perspective of life is a frustrating exercise, we're always frustrated with something. Kids need to learn how to tolerate frustration.
That's very important. And that's why when you see, or when I see adults having temper tantrums, I think, it's irritating for me to see that. But I think, well, I think nobody helped that child learn how to tolerate how difficult things as a child. And so while it's irritating, I do understand it. So that's when intellectually, that side of me, yeah, it's too bad. But emotionally, I think, why don't you just grow up and do what you're supposed to do as an adult? Why don't we shift a little bit into academic performance? Child is watching the screen, various screens, too much. What happens to learning and performance at school?
Evolution of challenges in learning can be directly traced to how kids are able to or allowed to manage their time. The structure of the day begins to fall apart very easily when kids are exposed to screens, and the nature of learning and how the brain processes information is directly dependent on the nature of stimuli that we're exposed to. So ability to sit and watch continuously a 1.5 hour long video feature is severely affected with kids being able to see very brief 2-3 minute increments of a YouTube video or TikTok or whatever short video format there is. The brain, again, we're back to white matter. The wiring has to support ability of the brain to sit for a period of time and stay with a particular stimulus. So the gravitational pull will always be towards something that is pleasurable and not frustrating or effortful. I would always postulate that learning is an effortful process. It can be made fun, but it is an effortful process because it implies change in the brain tissue. So it requires work. So from that perspective, the wars between clients and their parents, I see a lot of kids in this particular situation where literal wars will take place when studying or homework needs to be done, but the screen is available and child is throwing themselves on the floor because they don't want to do the homework. It begins at age 6 and it gets progressively worse unless it's captured in time. One of the probably more dramatic examples where the lack of pruning of white matter leads to a visible deterioration is deterioration of penmanship. The children today, handwriting is dramatically worse in most cases. I'm not saying for all cases, but in most cases, because they're not writing as much. They're not expected to write as much. They use keyboards, they use screens, and writing is a fine motor skill. We have stopped teaching kids to write cursive in many schools. It's a fine motor skill. So as a society, as peoples, we're beginning to give up on some aspects of our humanity because screens have so entered our reality of living.
Tell me a little bit about sleep patterns.
As we mentioned in the last episode, the effects of the blue light on sleep are well known and well documented. However, from my sort of neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience perspective, what is more detrimental is the engagement. It's the stimulation. So when we're engaged in something exciting, it can be a video, it can be a game, it can be a conversation with a friend, the activation of neurotransmitters are secreted, acetylcholine is secreted. So now you have a battle between activational neurotransmitters that are stimulating brain into alert state to process information with the intent to fall asleep, and neurotransmitters that have to come in to begin to shut down the brain activity. So kids end up staying up later and later and later, and it's harder to get them out of bed. They're sleep deprived. Sleep deprivation will affect their learning at school, and on and on and on.
Yeah, that's very helpful. What advice do you give parents who are engaged in these wars? I guess they can start early. I think of wars via preteen situation most often, but I guess depending on the parents and the child, it can start much earlier than that. So from 6 to 12, how do you advise parents to proceed with screen time? Because I don't think you're saying don't watch anything, because I know you suggested things.
No, I mean, the screens are part of our life, and children socialize around what kind of games they play, what material they watch. So it's here to stay. I found personally working with children as a psychiatrist and as a therapist, they're highly responsive to education, meaning informing them what the purpose of the screen is, which is diversion, which is entertainment, which is it has a place in the scope of the entirety of the day, but it is not the goal of the day or the main course, so to speak. So thinking of screen as dessert, the main course is performing chores around the house, studying, engaging in physical activity, and really encouraging parents to focus on the screen not as a diversion to entertain the child so the parents have some free time, because child can get a bag of Legos and play with them. It's entirely possible. Children have done it for a long time before the screens entered our lives. So if children are told, go play, they will find a way to play. It'll be a little more frustrating than the screen itself, so the screen is preferable. But if the parent, in a very neutral way, says the screen is between this time, and that is it, I think it's really sort of just like you would think of a complete meal for dinner, you're thinking of what the complete day looks like structurally.
That's a good way to put it. I also think that you've recommended that families watch things together. Maybe not everything.
Yeah.
There's only so much, I referred to this last week. There's only so much Paw Patrol one can watch, but as an adult, but there are certainly things that the family can watch, and then they can explain things and make sure that screen time is limited.
Absolutely. I think that shared experience, and again, this comes from clinical material and personal experience. Um, Kids want to be with their parents, especially at this age. They want to share the experience. I had to watch SpongeBob movie last night, which was less than exciting for me, but it was very exciting for my almost 8-year-old that we shared that experience, and he was pointing out the jokes that he found funny, and we laughed at a couple of things, and so those moments of shared experience when they can share with us their joy create an environment in which then we can watch something that is more serious, and they will need our help to interpret what is really going on because it's scary or frustrating or unknown. So yes, I recommend a family movie every night, something that everybody can agree on. Admittedly, if I have to see Pirates of the Caribbean one more time, I will throw up, but that's what family movies are for.
Well, that's a good point. And I also want you to know that I've watched a fair amount of SpongeBob as well. So not Pirates of the Caribbean yet so much, but SpongeBob.
It's coming.
So this might be a good place to segue into Erik Erikson's stage of development, because we have been talking about it some through neuroscience, but it's a time when children start to develop competency. They start to learn to do things if they have the opportunity. And not only in school, but Harry was talking about building a fire. Well, you can watch somebody build a fire on television or on your phone. You can watch somebody go camping. There's somebody that takes his boys camping. I don't remember the show. And you can pick up a lot of tips. But it's not the same thing as taking your child camping and teaching him or her how to build fire, how to collect wood. And maybe not on this trip, but children can watch other children climb trees, but there's nothing like climbing a tree. I used to love to do that when I was a kid, to climb a tree and think. And I think that's where I thought of being a psychologist, because my father had a restaurant and I would think about the various people who were there and their stories. It was in the Florida Keys. And I said in one of the books I've written that there were either people who were running from something, it seemed to me as a child, or running to something, like they thought this was paradise. So thinking in trees was very important, but the tree was a big part of it. But also, in terms of competency, there's so many things that children can't do. And along with competency, I want to add that self-esteem goes with that. So if you learn to build a fire and you learn to do it well, that enhances self-esteem. So it's not just school activities that make children feel good about themselves. That the school does it as well. I mean, an A is an A, an A plus is an A plus. But there are lots of life experiences that help build competency as well. And if you watch these things on TV, for example, somebody building sandcastles, it's not, I mean, how can you get the same thrill of watching somebody build a sandcastle or being buried in the sand by other family members? You can't, it's not the same experience as if you're there and the water splashes up on you and maybe washes your sandcastle away, and then you can always rebuild it. You might have to wait for the tide to change, but it's a whole different ball of wax, so to speak. You can't just watch a painter paint something and learn as much as you can with paints and a brush and You might make a big mess, but there's a lot to be learned from that. So all kinds of activities that are playful. Uh, Even dolls. I wrote a book on Barbie, and I have some thoughts about Barbie, but children, girls mainly, who play with Barbies create all kinds of fantasies. So it's not the same as watching anything on television. So the main thing is to allow children to do things and encourage them. Sometimes doing it with them is very important as well. If it's maybe a big project and they need help, maybe a robot, but watching somebody do it is much different than doing it together or to have the child do it him or herself. So I think the same principles apply as Dr. Gill was talking about in terms of things with parents to do. I mean, we went over this, but to set limits, to work with your child, to encourage a child when they're frustrated, just help them stick to it. And you might have to do a little bit of it, but basically you want kids to do things, learn to do things by themselves too. Now, you know a lot about psychoanalytic development, Dr. Gill. What are your thoughts about?
To give you an example of that physicality of real world and real experience. My son loves to play Planetcraft, which has since been deleted, and I'll explain why. Because he's really in exactly this stage of development, so it's very, very fresh in my mind observing him. So in Planetcraft, there's a lot of building and a lot of digging of holes and moving large amounts of material. And it's all very, very light. So to teach him, and he was interested in this, I didn't force him to do it, to teach him the physicality of actually digging a hole in the ground. He's behind the house digging a hole in the ground. And then he wanted to get a shovel. So we went out and we bought a shovel. And then he was digging with that shovel. And he learned it's not that easy. And then almost broke his shovel because I did not do a good job with it. So he was very mad with me. So we have to go buy another shovel. And I'm saying all of this to say it is interesting to see him learn actually the challenges and the frustrations of actual physical space. And also we had an interactive experience in which he saw me be also incapable of doing something and breaking something, and he was mad at me. And we generally had a really good time. Back to the point I wanted to make, and I don't want to miss it because this is the period where a lot of kids get into a lot of trouble with screens. The maliciousness and perniciousness of chat within the games cannot be overstated. The Planetcraft that he enjoys playing had a chat box, and he promised that he wouldn't use the chat box. And then I saw that he was using his chat box, and then we agreed this is just not a good idea, and the Planetcraft has to go. Why? Because adults come in, adults pretend to be children, adults give kids gifts, which take form of money that's inside the game. And many of you are familiar with the Roblox situation in which children were kidnapped, basically, or they start sharing sexually inappropriate material. And unfortunately, in our program at Embark, we end up with kids that got into a world of trouble simply because they're playing innocent game. And these interactive, chatty, internet-connected, enabled games are tremendously dangerous and really require adult oversight to make sure that kids are safe. I hope that was an okay point to make, Karyne.
Absolutely. And it just occurred to me that one thing I think that we still want to do is encourage children to read books. If they're watching screens all the time, chances are they're not also reading that much. I mean, they could be, but
I'm totally with you on that topic. And in fact, with both of my kids, the trade-off has been the amount of time that they read is the amount of time that they get the screen. Meaning not the TV screen, but the play screen, the iPad, whatever. And there is a product. I don't necessarily want to put a plug on which product it is, but there's a product where you can time and require a child to read before the device will switch and allow them to play games, which is interesting. I did find that a child can just sit there and wait and not necessarily read, and then move on to playing the game. So the traditional, here's the book, honey, you read it, and when you're done, we can have the screen time, really works well.
Yeah. I also I want to make another point about reading. Children, it's not just toddlers who like to be read to. 6-year-olds often like to be read to as well. So it can be very soothing for a parent to read to a child, even older kids. I've even worked with couples who read books together. One will read one chapter and one will read the other chapter, or however they want to work it out. But there can be something. It's an activity they're doing with someone, and it can be soothing. So, especially with kids in this age range, they're not too old to be read to. Also, I wanna we highlighted the positive side, the industry side, where kids build competencies. But the flip side of the coin is inferiority. And that's something that stays with one if it's not ameliorated in some way. So if kids aren't doing the positive things we talked about to become competent teenagers and then adults, they can often feel very inferior to other kids and then other peers when they get older. So industry and inferiority, they're developed pretty early. It's important to keep that in mind.
I think it's a very important topic, and indeed that sense of inferiority is what leads kids to self-perpetuated social withdrawal and ultimately depression and anxiety, and they end up in treatment for that very reason. And if they feel inferior in real life, they will sometimes withdraw into the virtual online world of friends, where they feel a sense of agency. Clinically, I have seen people in their late 20s and 30s that have, because of the sense of inferiority that started at this age, have essentially spent their entire second decade of life in the state of inferiority, with cannabis as a self-regulator and engagement with online world, because they did not develop a sense of agency, a sense of ability to tolerate frustration, to go through school, through love, through finding partners, all of that. And it really starts at this age. So in some ways, devoting this much time to this age group is really important. Here's where the little brains really are beginning to transform into little people and little adults.
That's an excellent point. Well, I think today it might be good to stick with one stage of development from both perspectives. We want people to have an opportunity to think about these things without providing too much material. So a few takeaways from this segment is that reduction in white matter integrity from a neuropsych perspective is important, and there are many ramifications for that. So, and that does develop or can from or is associated with too much screen time.
In this period of time, the amount of white matter needs to be pruned in order to enhance the efficiency, capacity, and skills of the activities that the child needs to engage in effectively. So anything that is distracting a child from the development of learning skills, as we said, reading skills, social skills, is going to create problems that will need fixing or attention in the later periods of life. So the parental oversight, engagement, and limitations of screen time and ongoing curation of screen time is really, really important.
Right. From a psychological perspective, we talked about competency and mastery. well, it leads to children feeling good about themselves. I'm not sure if I use the word self-esteem, but it's also a way self-esteem is developed, and it goes hand in hand with competency. That might seem like common sense, but uh, people don't always put the two words together. So you do something well, and you feel good about it, and the reverse or the other side of that is feeling not very good, like you're not competent, and then people feel inferior, and that has lifelong effects on one's personality. The other thing that I want to say is that parents can, and I learned this from you, Dr. Gill, indirectly, because you've talked about doing this, the parents can talk to their children about the negative effects of too much screen time. I mean, therapists can do that too, but so can parents, and why that devices need to be monitored, instead of just saying, well, you can only do it for 40 minutes and that's that. But to explain to them why it matters that they do these other things and why screen time is limited, I think is very important. Just like it's important to talk to children about most and many things.
In terms of practicality, at least, I don't know if people will find this useful or not, but that didactic educational approach, I really do find that kids respond to it. My 6-year-old responded to repeated observations that if there's too much screen time, that he's more emotional. He gets more teary, more irritable. It's harder to get the screen out of his hands. And it became a part of the dialogue between us to say, hey, you're getting a little emotional. Let's put the screen down. It also created the absence of fight over screen, that we're not fighting. It's like, okay, it's time for it to go. Because now it's framed into, this is entertainment. This is not the goal of your day. It is something that you do when everything else has been done. The other part of the language that I found useful with kids, I call brain the head, the brain box. And we talk about things that grow the brain box and things that don't grow the brain box, i.e. brain rot. So we look at computer games as stuff that is entertaining and pleasurable, but doesn't grow the brain box. And practicing penmanship and reading and digging a hole in the backyard, that grows the brain box. And like I will say, kids do respond to that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I like that. Just like with anything else, if you explain to children why they can and can't do things, they may not like it, but it's much better than just saying no. You can't, just because I said so. So, well, I think that will do it for today. Thank you so much, and we'll continue with this special series on brain rot and hopefully give you some ideas of how to change that, because it's an epidemic in our society, so and around the world. So we need to change that and bring back creativity and industry. Okay, we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.